Now, to round off these introductory lessons on Blazor, I want to discuss and clarify a potentially confusing topic. It relates to the two typical ways in which Blazor client-side applications are said to be hosted in a live production environment. The two hosting models are normally just referred to as Blazor Server-side and WebAssembly hosting models. I'm personally not a fan of this terminology, but it is what it is. And on numerous occasions, I've seen how confusing the two hosting models are for beginners because the term hosting is used in a very particular fashion in the Microsoft documentation. The first thing we must be clear on is that both client-side and server-side Blazor applications can be hosted on other web servers, even non-Microsoft or non.NET based servers. I know that I've not spoken much about .NET yet, but we'll get to what that's all about in part 2 of this series. Suffice to say that regardless of what implementation we are talking about, Blazor can be hosted on other web servers that run operating systems other than Windows, such as, for example, Linux. Next, once you have coded your client-side or server-side application for that matter, you would naturally need to deploy or publish it to some hosting service on the internet to make it available for the rest of the world to access, right? And as I just mentioned, your Blazor app does not need to be hosted by a Microsoft-based web server such as IIS. You can have your app hosted by and served to the world using other web servers like Apache or Nginx. Now, where the confusion comes in is in a very special scenario where a client-side Blazor application is hosted by a server-side Blazor application. But the server-side application itself would normally be hosted on another web server being operated by a hosting service provider. So in this scenario, you can have up to 2 different web server applications working together in order to enable the client side of your Blazor web application. Now, what I'm about to tell you will only really become clear when we go into Visual Studio in part 3 of this course. But when you create a regular standalone client-side Blazor WebAssembly application in Visual Studio, Visual Studio will create one project in your overall solution, a client-side project. Once you have coded and tested your application, you can then deploy it to a hosting service provider such as AWS or Azure or any other hosting service. However, there is a second way in which we can create a Blazor WebAssembly application project inside of Visual Studio. And now you need to pay attention. We can create a Blazor solution where the web application is, quote unquote, hosted inside of an ASP.NET Core application. When we do this, Visual Studio will generate 3 projects in your solution: a client-side code project, a server-side code project, and a shared project in which we can write C# code that can be shared by both the client and the server projects. You will see a demonstration of all of this in part 5 of this series. Now, if this is confusing to you, don't worry, you are in good company. Based on what I just said, it sounds like the server-side application is hosting your client-side application, right? Well, yes, but that is not the whole story. This could be confusing because the server-side application is not the traditional hosting service that you might be familiar with. You might associate a hosting service with something like IIS, Apache, or Nginx. What really happens behind the scenes in this scenario is that when your Blazor web application starts up, it is the server-side part of your application that configures the web services to listen for incoming HTTP requests from the clients. The web services could be those of IIS, Kestrel, or some other server. This server-side application can absolutely host your client-side application all by itself using Kestrel that ships with ASP.NET Core. But this server-side application still needs to be hosted and run on a web server that is capable of running an ASP.NET Core application. Yes, you can set up your Blazor application in a way where the server-side application creates its own Kestrel web server to serve the client. And we refer to this as a self-hosting configuration, but this is not typical. Usually you will still have the industrial strength web servers like IIS or Nginx fielding all the incoming HTTP requests from the internet and relaying those requests to the Kestrel server that is hosting your client-side application. These configuration options are complex, and it would only make sense to go into more detail when we build and publish our applications. So for now, just remember that when we choose the Blazor server-side hosting option during the setup of our solution, all that happens is that an additional server-side project and a shared code project is created by Visual Studio for you alongside your client-side project. It does not necessarily mean that we are making the usual web services redundant, and it does not mean that we are creating a self-hosting scenario. We'll see all this in action in part 5. For now, I think this is enough information to take in. So let's summarize everything and take a break before we move on to part 2.